let's go over the invoice editing window. To do this, I'm just going to select a project in Studiometry that has unbilled work items and create a new invoice. Now there's a bunch of different ways in Studiometry that you can create a new invoice. You can select a project, and then from the overview you can hit Add Invoice. You can click on the plus button below the overview and select Add Invoice from here. You can right click on a project and select Create New Invoice, but there's a bunch of different ways and they all bring up the same invoice editing window that we see here. So the main thing we're going to want to see here is in this window across the top we have 4 sections. We have Edit Invoice, View Invoice, Payments, and Notes. And when you select a section, it will display the information below. So it's just 4 different tabs with information from each section presented below. First section is the Edit Invoice section, and this is where we'll be able to customize the majority of the things that we can change when editing an invoice. The first field here is whether or not it's been paid, but obviously we're creating a new invoice, so we don't want to mark it as paid yet. Then we can see what client and project the invoice will be attached to. The invoice ID number, which when we create a new invoice, this will automatically be populated based on the settings that we have in our Preferences window ID numbering section. So there's a separate tutorial about how this is generated and how you can customize this to get exactly the ID number that you'd like when you're creating a new invoice. Below that we have Date Issued, which is the day that we create the invoice, Date Due, which is the day that we want the invoice to be paid by, and Date Paid. Date Paid will remain blank until we mark the invoice as paid. Date Due, the date is actually generated based on our preferences. So we have it set up to generate the invoice with a date due of 2 weeks from the date issued. If we wanted to change this, or how far out this would be, we would go to Studiometry's Preferences window, and then to the Billing Settings section, and we can change the invoice due in days here. Now this is a global setting for all of your projects. If you wanted to change it for a specific project, you can do that as well. I'm just going to leave this window open in the background, and I'm going to go to a project in Studiometry's main window, and then I'm going to select Project menu, Edit Project, and from here we can go to the project's billing settings where we can change the days until invoice due. Now if this is blank, it'll default to the client setting, and if that's blank, that'll default to the global setting in the main preferences window. So you can have it set up for each client or each project to have a different number of days until invoices are due. Now next to the Date Due field we have this little Notify checkbox. If this is checked, then Studiometry will give us an alert if an invoice becomes overdue. So you can have individual invoices alert you that they're overdue. And you can also disable this for certain invoices as well if you have ones that you don't want to be alerted about. So that's what that checkbox does. Then on the right here, we're going to come back to multi-project in a minute, but we have Contact, which is just you can select a contact from your client. So since this invoice will be associated with the Google client, it will show the list of all of that client's contacts. And when you generate the invoice, it will pull all of that contact information for phone number and address and any other contact related information based on your selection here. The currency is the currency that will be shown for the invoice when you generate it. Now each of the work items on your invoice, when you create those, they are stored in a specific currency. So you could have all of the work items stored in Canadian dollars, and then when you generate the invoice, if you wanted to invoice in USD, you could do that, and Studiometry will convert all of the items to the appropriate value in the selected currency. The next setting is the Total From selection. Now this is important because this determines how the invoice will calculate its total and total due. If we have Total From Debt Credits, what this means is we'll see a list of items. These are all the work items that we added to the project previously, and we'll be able to select or deselect items to add to the invoice. This is the standard way of invoicing in Studiometry. You enter your work in, and then when you're ready to invoice, you create your invoice and you bill for that work. However, if you wanted to just invoice for a specific amount, you can change the total from to entered amount, and then we'll see that this becomes disabled, and you can actually just enter the invoice total and the tax total at the bottom here by typing them in. So that's a way to enter a custom amount for an invoice, and what that will do is just ignore any of the work items on the project that have not yet been invoiced. But we're going to go back to total from debt credits because this is the standard way to create an invoice in Studiometry. And I'll just recheck the items here so that they're all selected. Now, how invoices work in Studiometry is, say this hourly work item, if I add it to this invoice, the next time I go to create an invoice, it will not appear as an available item to add to that invoice. Each work item can only be added to one invoice, and that's so that you don't double bill for your work items. So when you come to the new invoice window, it will list out any available items that can be invoiced. Now, another thing to note is if you're using running timers in Studiometry, your paused and running timers will not appear here. They have to be completely stopped to be able to be added to an invoice. So if you have any paused or running timers, you're going to want to stop them before you start creating your invoice. And now let's go back to the multi-project invoice setting up here. Now, if this is not checked, the only items that will appear in this list here are the ones that are associated with our selected project. But if we check the multi-project invoice setting, then all of the projects associated with the client will have any of their uninvoiced items appear here. So if I check this, we can see that now there's a project column here, and it will show all of the work items for this client that have not yet been invoiced. So these three at the bottom are the three original items that we were going to bill for on this project, and then the four on the top are associated with the other project for this client. So this is one way that we can bill for all of the items that a client has not yet had invoiced with one invoice. And this will prevent us from having to create one invoice for each project when we can just create one big multi-project invoice. And the last thing that we'll look at in this section is the ability to merge and split individual items. Now, why you might want to do this is if you have just a ton of different items on your invoice and you want to consolidate them, you can do this by selecting multiple items and then hitting merge, and then Studiometry will show you the parent item, and then it'll show you below that all of the other individual items that you've merged with that item. What this will do is that these two work items will both be billed for and added to the invoice, but it will only show as one line item, and Studiometry will try to intelligently figure out any of the fields that will appear, such as the description or the employee or the type. But Studiometry will warn you if you try to merge two different item types, like for example, if you try to merge an expense item, which is not hourly, with design, which is hourly, then you might have some issues when you create the invoice. So this is just one way to manage the items within the invoice editing window, is by merging or splitting individual items. So if I just split those like I did there, we'll just have again a flat list of all of these items that will appear on the invoice. So I'm going to change this back from multi-project to a single project invoice. And then we can see here again, the only items that appear are the ones that are associated with the project that we're within currently. And then we're going to move to the next section, which is the View Invoice section. And we can see here at the top we have our visual invoice templates, and then on the left we have our code-based invoice templates. So we can click to select and produce the invoice using whichever template we'd like. These templates are completely customizable, so you can change anything you want on here. You can add your logo, you can move the fields around, you can change what information is shown for each item, but you have complete control over what is produced with these templates. And we have a separate tutorial video about creating invoice templates and how to use the template editor. But just so you know, if you want to edit these, you can do so by going to Studiometry's Preferences window and then going to the Template section. And then here we can see this is the same list of visual templates that we have, and then our code-based invoice templates come from the bottom here. So in addition to previewing the invoice with the generated content in this section, we can also print, email, and export the invoice as well. All of these will create PDFs that you can send to your client or export to file, but you can do that directly from this window. The next section we're going to skip over payments for one minute and go to notes, and that's because there's just one field in here. You can add notes to your invoice. This is a big text field where you can add whatever information you'd like, and you can either store this internally so that your client can't see it, or you can present it to your client if you'd like. And the way to decide between whether or not this is shown is based on the invoice template. If the invoice template has a variable for your invoice notes, then it will show your invoice notes in that location. But if the template doesn't have a variable, then the invoice notes won't appear on your invoice. So it's really just, it's a field that you can modify or enter whatever information you'd like here, and then you can either show it or hide it when you go to produce your invoices. And before we go to the payment section, I'm actually just going to save this invoice. So when I hit OK, what that's going to do is it's going to mark all three of these items as invoiced. It will create the invoice and save it to this project, and we'll be able to see the date issued and the date due, and we'll see all that on the project. So I'll hit OK, and now we can see here that the invoice appears under the project's overview invoices section. One other place that you can view a project's invoices is if you go up to the location bar up top, you can click on the menu all the way at the right, and you can select Invoices. And this will show you, again, all of the project's invoices. So now that this one has been saved, we can come back to this invoice at any time and mark it as paid. And to do that, we just double-click on it to bring back the invoice editing window. Now there's a couple of ways that we can have the invoice marked as paid. We can actually go to the payments section and add payments here if we'd like. But the easiest way to do it is if your client sent in a payment for the grand total amount of what is due for the invoice, you can just check this invoice has been paid here, and Studiometry will automatically create a payment for the invoice when you hit OK. So what this does is it will fill in the date paid based on the date that you check it. And then at the bottom here, if we leave this checked when we hit OK, Studiometry will bring up the payment entry window where we can enter any information about the payment that we want. So I'll hit OK, and we can see here that a payment entry window was opened where we can enter the amount and the date and any other description or payment information that we want. So I'll just hit OK, and then it's added that to our payment tracker. So now if I go back to the invoices window, we can see the amount due has updated, the date paid is now shown, and if I double click to go back to this invoice again, we can go to the payments list and see any payments that are associated with the invoice. Now obviously this invoice was paid off with just one payment, but if you get partial payment from your client, every single payment will appear here, and you can double click on any of these to view or edit information about that payment. And the last thing we're going to look at here is the things on the bottom of the payment section, which there's the setting here to pay from a retainer. And this is grayed out because this client does not have a retainer. But if it did, Studiometry would automatically ask if you wanted to pay funds from the retainer to pay an invoice when you create the invoice. You can modify retainer information for a client by going to any client in Studiometry and then selecting Client menu, Edit Client, and then there's a Retainer tab here where you can customize information about the balance and the history of a retainer. And then finally, at the bottom here we have the Generate Invoice button. I'm going to go back to the View Invoice section really quick to show you what this button really does. Now if we have a visual template selected, the Generate Invoice button, this will just bring up a separate window to show us what's on the invoice. It will produce the same branded PDF content that we can see here. But if we have a code-based template selected, then we can't actually see the information within this window. We would have to generate it. So to do that, we could either click on this View Invoice button here, or from any section of the window, we can click Generate Invoice, and we can either generate it to a file or we can generate a preview. So that's what that button does. So if you're going to be using visual templates, which are really the norm in Studiometry, these are the standard way to create invoices. The Generate Invoice button, you can pretty much just ignore that because all it's going to do is produce the same content that you see here. It's just there as a convenience method to get to that window from any part of the invoice editing window. So if I hit OK, one final thing to note is if we want to quickly see what we would have seen if we open up the Generate Invoice window, we can click on the preview of an invoice from within the client or project overview, and that will bring up this window, which we again can print or email or export the invoice, and we can see the same content available here. So that's it. Those are the basics to the invoice editing window. If you have any questions about this or anything else related to Studiometry, please get a hold of us at support.oranged.net.